Hello, hello, everyone. We're just going to give a moment for others to join. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Mark, how's your Tuesday going?
Tuesday is good. It's sunny here and nice. It's been rainy this week, snowy last week. It's kind of crazy weather, but it's very nice today.
Yeah,
How about
this
yours?
winter has been insane with the weather. What about for you, Kelsey?
I mean, it's Oregon, so it's rain.
Rain
Raining
all
over
the time.
Well, we have a lot of people coming in right now. We're going to give just another moment. Hi, Rob. Hi, Lewis. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for joining us. Any fun summer plans, anyone? No?
Not really, not for me. I mean, every plan is a fun plan, but nothing specific. No big travels, no going out of country. Still coming out of the winter, It feels like it's not summer yet.
That is very true, especially with the weather where you are.
Yeah. I would not be surprised if it blizzards and snows a couple more times before summer's here.
All right. All right. Well, I'm here to introduce everyone. My name is Miranda Schoombs. I'm the product marketing manager here at Lytics. With us, we have Kelsey Abeg, who is a senior product manager here at Lytics, and we have Mark Hayden, who is the VP of product. Today, we'll be taking you through identity resolution, and we'll be really digging deeper into the topic, and we're going to let Kelsey go ahead and take it away.
All right, awesome. As we mentioned, my name's Kelsey Abeg, and I'm a senior product manager at Lytics. Today, we're going to cover ID resolution. And the reason why we're covering ID resolution today is we just want to talk about sort of what Lytics does, how it handles certain ID solutions. It's becoming more and more apparent that resolving identities down is actually very challenging across the technical landscape that we've got going on right now with the multitude of tools, disparate data sets. And what we're hoping to do here is to sort of talk about the Lytics solution and how it's built to sort of maintain the complexity of your MarTech stack and how we can help solve some of those more complex ID resolution issues. So the first thing that we're going to sort of talk about is just why it's important, right? Identity resolution is important because it's how we build our consumers. The more information we know about our consumers, the better they do in campaigns, the more will show up in campaigns and in audiences. So it's always important that we're able to build out those profiles. Why this is challenging, right? There's a huge reason why this is challenging. I'm not going to read this slide verbatim, but we have sort of the idea, right? It's that there are so many different data sets now, disparate data sets, disparate technologies, and none of them are really built to work well together, right? There's never one shared identifier across all of them. In most cases, each one of them will have their own internal ID and then potentially an external ID that can be used like email across systems. So that's sort of the first. The second is like no businesses are going to be alike. All strategies are going to be different and all strategies evolve, which means how your consumer interacts with your MarTech stack is also going to evolve and change. And it's super important to sort of understand those patterns and understand how we continue to sort of grow with the consumer journeys and involve with them, right? Because a static ID resolution strategy is only going to be good the moment it's created. After that, it will start to go stale. It will start to sort of prove to not be as successful as you would hope it would be over time, right? And so that's sort of where we notice the biggest challenges. And then obviously, finally, the big cookie challenge of 2023 is how do we connect that third-party data set to first-party? How do we get more first-party users? How do we understand when exactly our consumers are migrating to that known state, right? It's not just important that the conversions are happening, that we're able to track them in a timely manner. So all of those are building up into what we would call a pretty challenging landscape for ID resolution. Now we can talk about the goal of Lytics, right? What we've learned over the last decade and some change about ID resolution is the first part is just stitching the consumers together, right? So that's sort of piece one is how do I get my IDs joined to a single consumer? How do I build out that profile? But that's really just the beginning. Once you've done that, there's so much more to consider, especially when it comes to the fact that no ID res strategy is going to be perfect, right? There's always going to be consumers that fall into edge cases, that don't behave like we would expect, that don't do the certain actions that we would expect. Or when they do, it's like a household, I've got 10 people using the same machine, right? So it's better understanding that, and not only that, but understanding over time that profiles will evolve and change. Consumers may do something we don't want them to do. Profiles may join in the way we don't want them to. And it could be just edge cases, right? So it's understanding that we need to be flexible as a solution. And not only that, but it needs to be as automated as possible. This is something that can sort of handle itself over time. And that's obviously in the lens of security, compliance, and privacy, right? Which is more important now than it ever was, especially when we take into account PII and that sort of personal identifiable information. So the Lytics task has been to just build a solution that can sort of handle those different scenarios. And that's where we get into our approach. So Lytics has broken up ID res into 3 different key stages. The first is define, the second is construct, and the third is maintain. In the define stage, it's all about building out ID relationships, understanding what the IDs are and how they perform in the MarTech stack, how they show up, why they show up. Construct is all about building the profile. And it may seem like define should do that, but in reality, constructing is just a materialized view of a profile based off of the definitions we've decided, right? And that view of the profile may change as more IDs enter the ecosystem or IDs leave the ecosystem or IDs change behavior in the ecosystem. So it's good to understand not just how we expect the IDs to relate to each other, but also how that should materialize into a profile over time. And then finally, maintain. Maintain is super, super important to Lytics. It's not something that we see in the wild very often. It's all about maintaining the profile once it's been built. The understanding is that once a profile has been built, it's just built, right? It's going to continue to grab data. It's going to continue to grow. We may see ID behaviors that we don't expect. And all of that with the assumption that it will sort of just take care of itself. And in most cases, eventually, right, platform limits will come into play. The profiles may not update. They'll become stale. They'll run into data management issues. And all of that just comes down to the fact that if you don't continue to take care of those profiles, they will eventually fall into a bad state. And it's the ones that are the most interactive across your ecosystem that usually get there first, because they are the ones that are sort of grabbing the most data across the different systems, across the different tools. And so it's super important to Lytics that we're able to take those really high value users and keep them healthy over time. So that is the 3 different stages or steps. So we're going to sort of, the structure of this, we're going to break it down by each step, dive into each one means. And then obviously, if you have questions, keep them coming. Mike is here to help. And then at the end, I'm hoping to save like 10 minutes. So around 11:50 PST for some of those questions too. So the define stage, once again, what's it about? It's about taking IDs that we would expect to see on a profile and defining them by strength and by relationship to each other. So if a consumer should have 5 cookies and 1 email, right? It's good to understand they'll have many cookies in 1 email. If they're going to have multiple customer IDs with that email, totally fine. It's just building those relationships out. So when our graph is built, we're pointing to or creating edges or lines right between the nodes in the correct way. So it's important that we're able to sort of track that behavior and understand how we would expect to see the IDs work together. And so that's sort of what this visual is telling you, is we'll take in the IDs and then we'll rank them and decide what's strong and what's weak. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a minute. So the first thing that we really want to talk about in profile definition is, why is it important to define a profile? What do we need to consider as we're defining a profile? So as we're going through this step, usually what we try to glean from our customers is, how important is accuracy to your profile? And it may be like, well, I want my profiles to be accurate all the time. But something to consider is the accuracy of your profile is driven by the data that you pass in and the integrity of the IDs that we bring in, right? So if we've got a match rate somewhere in the system that's polling at 30 to 60%, right? That means that those profiles that have been built are relying on something that is a little bit less accuracy than, let's say, 100%, which is sort of the sort of deterministic pass. So that's sort of step 1, is how important is accuracy? What sort of matching capabilities do we want to bring into this data? The second is, how do we want to manage the strength of our identifiers, right? So what is the strongest identifier you have in your ecosystem? What's the weakest? And when we talk about strength of IDs, we're really talking about persistency, right? So someone might have 5 emails, but that would be surprising, right? That would be a high number, where someone might have 100 cookies, and that's not surprising. So it's understanding that like email is going to be much stronger than cookie because of that. And so it's that behavior. It's understanding the IDs and their relationships to each other. And then finally, sort of how can these materialized profiles be analyzed and delivered to other tools? So how do we know who these people are? How can we communicate who they are downstream to other tools? And this sort of speaks to a little bit the micro and macro version of ID resolution, which we'll talk about in just a second. But understanding that ID resolution in Lytics doesn't have to be the same as how you resolve identities across your entire stack, how you resolve identities into a single tool. It's really about understanding how we want to deliver value on the profiles we're activating on. And that's really what it comes down to when we talk about understanding how we can work with other systems. So the first thing we're going to start out with is how important is accuracy? And I touched on this a little bit, but what's important to understand is there's sort of 2 different key ways to determine identities in this space. The first is deterministic, which is an exact match, right? Okay, I see an email coming in. That email is going to be the ID for the person. And if I see that exact email coming in from somewhere else, then I can match it, right? It's that sort of identical match system where we know 100% sure that this person is this person because they have the exact same ID. Whereas probabilistic is sort of that close enough in that they share enough, maybe less strong attributes, where like first name or last name or address or phone number, where we know other people can have the same first name. We know addresses can be shared across different people if people move around, and we know phone numbers can change, right? But if you get enough of those things grouped together, you can sort of get an idea of who that person is and how they can be identified. And so it's recognizing which match solution do we want to use, right? How do we want information to come into Lytics? And understanding this, right, we step into the deterministic piece a little bit more deeply. The deterministic piece is how our Lytics graph is going to work primarily. We have an LQL layer. It's Lytics query language. It's a transformative layer that allows you to normalize data to a certain point before it comes in. So it doesn't necessarily on entry have to be exact, but in the end, right, deterministic is going to be an exact match. So we can get it to that state by cleansing a string, extracting certain information from a string, dropping off certain beginning or ending characters, right? Doing validation on emails. There's a lot of things that we can do on entry to that data to cleanse it to a point where it matches. But just so you understand, our graph is very focused on exact matches. And what that means for us is that we can handle super complex ID resolution concepts very simply, and also with a lens on compliance, because we know who that person is exactly. So that's sort of the indicator of why we focus deterministic around our graph. With that being said, we also work with probabilistic solutions, and there are plenty of times when this comes into play. And it's also one of the primary reasons why we've built out Cloud Connect, which allows us to sort of use that probabilistic matching capability and bring in data and increase reach without necessarily impacting the accuracy of the data science or the modeling capabilities, right? So this is what we can say is there are plenty of places in your ID resolution strategy where probabilistic has a place, and it definitely has improvements, will make improvements across your strategy and help you increase enrichment, right? Or enrichment will help you increase match rates and saturation and decrease sparsity. And as we've mentioned probably before, we also have a Lytics warehouse solution where we stand up a BigQuery instance with our accounts. So there's additional enrichment and cleansing you can do there as well to sort of make this ID solution whatever we need it to be. It's composable enough in that way that you can sort of stick pieces together and resolve the profiles in the way that you need to, that continues to evolve your strategy, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And once again, right, the Lytics graph is ID agnostic, and that we can accept any IDs and any relationships of those IDs and continue to pull them in and merge that information. Then this is sort of the, how do you define and manage the strength of each identifier to ensure profiles are materialized properly? So this speaks to rank statements, which we brought up a little bit before. And a rank statement is just a rank of IDs from strongest to weakest. Why it's important, right? The first is it allows us to efficiently store data in our system. We don't want to have to have duplicative data stores anywhere. It's a waste. And it also isn't great for managing retrievals and updates into our system when we're trying to be a real-time platform, right? So what we can do here is we can store information assigned to our strongest identifiers, which will still be linked to the profile in the end, but it allows us to sort of manage the data in the back end, so there's nothing duplicative. Additionally, it gives us a super high level of control around retrieval of information and how we traverse the IDs to materialize the profile, right? It allows us to sort of it gives us directive on where we'll start and how that materialization can sort of impact the information on the profile. And then finally, right, it's just going to uphold the integrity of the profile longer. If we know what IDs, the strength of the IDs in the system, it allows us to, it gives us an ability to store, manage, iterate, compact, right? All the things that we like to do on our profiles, it gives us an anchor for that, understanding the IDs and the strength of them. So that's sort of the rank piece. And then finally, working with other systems, Lytics has a persistent ID. We generate one and it can sit on all profiles. It does out of the box. And what it does, right, is it acts as that anchor ID that will not change as profiles grow, right? And it will still persist as profiles merge. And so it's a great ID that you can use holistically externally from our system. So you could retrieve the profile using 10 different IDs and pull back in the payload the same Lytics ID. So external matching can be super useful in enrichment or insight-based analysis. It can also be helpful as just an additional ID that has a higher level of strength and integrity across systems. And so that's going to be our persistent ID. And as I mentioned, it will sit on all your user profiles. So that's going to be the define stage. So at the end of the define stage, right, what we're hoping to have is just a set of instructions for the system to create the profiles. So in the end, what we should have at this point is sort of a map of all of the IDs on each profile, right, and how those IDs relate to the consumer and to each other. And so what that allows us to do is as that data comes in, we can link data that's supposed to be linked, and we can separate data that shouldn't be linked. And this is where we get into the construct phase of ID resolution. The construct phase is sort of, as I mentioned, a materialized view that sits on top of our graph and creates the profile every time it's updated or every time you retrieve it, right? So, or it's rescored. So anytime that profile is modified, essentially, we retraverse it to make sure the information is accurate. And in that traversal, there are some levers that we can actually pull so that when the actual profile shows up in the UI, it's in the state that we want it to be. And so in this phase, right, construct, what we focus on is that we understand the data is not perfect, right? We understand that ID resolution, you might have a general rule set of how you would expect ID resolution to work in your system, but there's caveats, right? There's edge cases where consumers might be joined where they shouldn't be, or they might not be merging because we want them to. And for whatever reason, that merge directive goes against what we assumed our ID resolution should work. And so in this case, right, the primary questions we're going to be asking to understand how that profile should be materialized is what sort of information do we want to show on the profile, right? And that's important because we're getting data from all over the place, right? And some of that data might be the same, like first name, last name, demographic information. So how do we want that to show up on the profile? Right? Do we want it to overlap and last in wins from all those sources? Is it shared into a single attribute? Do you want them to be separated? Do you want them to be aggregated? And all of that comes down to, right, how we merge the information to a profile and then how we map it in our schema. Once again, right, you can add the fields and decide how you want them to map, whether they be a single field value or multiple fields, like a common delimited list. So there's a lot of flexibility there in how the information materializes. And that's really just driving how we use the data downstream. So how do we want to build audiences of these users? What sort of information do we need downstream to continue to drive them through the funnel? So that's sort of the first. And then the second is what rules should be used to maintain profile integrity. And we'll get into that in just a second. So the first sort of informative way of how we can bring information or surface it is Conductor, right? Which is one of our newer tools, allows you to map data without having to use terminal windows or LQL or VS Code, any sort of like coding practice. You can still do that. We still have the ability to write code in our backend and hit our APIs, but now you can also utilize our UI. And there's tons of visualizations in Conductor that help you understand how your IDs are resolving together, how they're merging across channels or streams, and then how that information surfaces on a profile. So all of that's going to be visible in Conductor, and it's how you can sort of maintain the attributes that you want living for your campaign activations. And then the second thing that Lytics does sort of in this space is we have a ton of different processes that we can do on the data to sort of join it or cleanse it in ways that aren't necessarily normalized yet. So we have enrichment capabilities where we can actually enrich teams real time as they're coming in. We have the ability we can clean things in a warehouse, bring that back in, use Cloud Connect to do more of a dynamic connection. And then we have complex aggregation capabilities in our LQL language or schema management language. There's a ton of different things that you can do here to decide how information should be materialized past the definition. And then there's the what rules should we use to maintain profile integrity. So something very common that happens once we've defined the profile is profiles will merge when they're not supposed to, over merging, or profiles may not merge even though we want them to, which is under merging. And so the first case we will call it over merge is likely to happen when, let's say we set up the rules and we say a consumer can have one email and multiple cookies, right? And then we have a household where you have 3 people sharing the same machine. And so they all have different emails, but they're all tied to the same cookie, right? And so we read that as, hey, this is actually uniquely one person, apparently, because they have that shared cookie and they have all these emails and we have all this information now appended from those emails and this cookie. And so you have this bloated over-merged profile. Well, Lytics can do and does do automatically once you've set up the features in the definition stage, it will actually uncouple profiles that throw it into conflict. And what that means is if we see an entity that's joined on, let's say, a weak identifier like cookie, where it throws that thing and says, well, I can only have one email and one cookie on a profile, this breaks that concept, right? What it can do is actually pull that apart and say, what we're going to do in this situation now is I'm actually going to unlink those emails and give them all the same cookie and store that information on 3 separate profiles. And it allows us to sort of self-heal in scenarios where consumers do things that may not be expected, right? So we continue to maintain the integrity of that profile with a singular email over time. And we're doing it in a way that requires no manual intervention from the customers. So that's sort of what we would call over merge protection. Under merge protection is where you have 2 profiles that either that should be linked and aren't, right? And that, let's call one of those scenarios, you have a database and you have 2 customer IDs and a single email. And what we thought initially when it was configured was that you should only have 1 email, 1 customer ID, right? When they log in, they get 1 customer ID and that's associated to the email they log in with. So that relationship is tied. But for some reason, right, there was some sort of refresh, some sort of legacy data, and that got mixed up in your warehouse. Well, Lytics can say is cool. Whenever we see that relationship, we'll let it live on the same profile. So we say, okay, if I see 2 customer IDs with a single email, and I know the email was seen with both customer IDs, then I can say, awesome, that's great. We can pull that in and unify it to a single profile. And that's almost channel-based ID resolution. So it's not thinking your entire global system. So if we see that customer ID with other IDs, we can protect against that and not merge it to the profile. But there are specific scenarios where channel-based scenarios where you may want to do that. And that's what under merge protection allows. And once again, this is meant to be a repetitive process. So it's something that you turn on initially and we can configure it to decide, and then it will run forever against your graph. So it's constantly looking for these anti-patterns that we don't want, and it resolves them on its own. So your profiles are getting healed over time, and they're continuing to maintain integrity no matter what the profiles are doing in the live space. And then finally, right, so that's going to be define and construct. And now we have maintain. So maintain is going to be one of the larger suites of features that we have, and it's one of the more unique ones that we offer. Once again, maintain is all about profile integrity. It's about understanding what profiles are useful, what information is useful on those profiles, and then removing everything else. And why this is important is that it's sort of the forgotten process because it only sort of surfaces itself over time. This isn't something that's going to be apparent in month 1 through 6 of an implementation of a CDP. It's probably not going to be something that's going to be apparent after a year, depending on your data volumes and the complexity of your strategy, right? So what we want to focus on over time is in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, that your CDP is still maintaining your profiles and that you're not hitting data limits that limit the performance. And so that's where we start to talk about sort of profile health overall. And the primary questions, right, is that we want to ask, that we've been asked, that we want to solve for is how can you validate the health of your ID resolution strategy over time? So how do I know it's still working? How do I know it's doing what I expect? How do I know it's doing what I want? If it's not doing what I want, how do I know? And how do I resolve it? So that's sort of question 1. The second is, what is the process for managing consent? The third is, how long is profile relevant if it no longer has means of being updated? And the fourth is, what is the life expectancy of expirable IDs, such as browser cookies? So once again, the maintenance is sort of understanding what information on the profile is helpful. How do we keep the relevant information on that profile safe? And then it's constantly up to date and make sure it reflects the status of the profile, especially right in regards to consent. And then how do we make sure that the information that's not useful, that maybe even profiles that aren't useful anymore, can be removed from the system in a way that's automated with like very little lift for our customers. And so that's where we're going to step into. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is validating the health of your ID resolution over time. So the first is going to be merge stats. What IDs have come in on my profile over time? And how do I know like what that impact is on the overall view? So as I mentioned before, Conductor is sort of one of our primary ID tools, right? It's going to be that feature package that's going to allow us to see on the profile what IDs have come in and when. And so you can actually see when you step into an individual profile, how that profile was built out over time. And you'll get a node view of that, and you'll also get an ID level of that. So you can see in both views over time how that entity built out. And not only that, but it will show you if that entity has any IDs that go in conflict with itself, right? So if a profile has 4 emails and we build the systems to say only a person should only have 1, our system will recognize that and point them out and say, hey, this profile's got a lot of emails. I wonder why, right? In some cases, we call that merge conflict. We additionally are merge protection. It just means you can see how things are resolving over time, and we can sort of step in and sort things out if we start to see patterns that we don't like about consumers. Because as I mentioned, your consumers will change their behavior. That's how they interact with your system, how they interact with different tools. That will change over time. New tools get introduced, new IDs get introduced. We expect ID resolution to evolve over time. And the intent here is that you don't have to keep reconfiguring for that evolution, that we can sort of expect the edge cases and the outliers and just continue with our day. So the second is going to be Profile Explorer. You can pull back any profiles you would like in a couple different places in our platform. Obviously, the first is Conductor, which will be at more of a graph level. So you can see how the IDs were built out. And then we have our decision engine profile view, which is more at an attribute behavioral level. So you can see sort of different content affinities, behavioral scores, and basic information, as well as the IDs that have built out the profile. So it allows you to see sort of where the information came from, how this profile is built out over time, and if any sort of merging or stitching happened, how that occurred. And then finally, schema visualizations is meant to show a high level view of ID resolution across the account. So it helps you understand if you have any sort of gaps. So a gap analysis of your ID res, and then it will show you IDs from every channel. And it will be able to sort of highlight what channels don't have IDs that bridge. So if you have a single channel that has 1 ID that's not shared across any other channels, that data will never merge across profiles, right? So this will help you view that and see that. It will help you understand if you've got sources that are sort of orphaned and aren't enriching onto profiles. It also allows you to strengthen your ID res strategy because you'll be able to see sort of the intersections between the different IDs themselves. And if you have a low intersection count of, let's say you have 10,000 emails and only 100 of them also have a customer ID on the profile, if that seems low, right, that's the first spot to audit it. So all of these visualizations can help you verify that your ID res strategy is working. And if it's not, it will give you clues as to how you can improve it. And then as far as managing consent, right, I've mentioned this before, but our system is completely real time from graph to entity to export, right? So what that means is, as long as we're able to stitch that information correctly, which as we mentioned before, the graph is fully robust enough to handle those scenarios, it will keep the data up to date on the profile as well, which means any given time you're retrieving that consent, especially, right, opt-ins for certain channels, opt-ins for communications, all of that's super important to keep up to date. And so a system that's real time that can merge that data to an entity, retrieve that profile, materialize it, and push it back out with the right information is going to keep you up to date across your downstream tools as well, as far as who you can reach out to and who you cannot. And then we have the out of the box schema as well. So essentially customers, when we auto add channels like ads or ESPs, emailing tools, it will auto generate schemas in some points, which will then also auto generate some of this opt-in consent and data attributes for the profile. So the schema is going to be super helpful for that, as well as managing that process. And if we find that fields aren't there or we want them to map in a certain way, once again, the schema is there for you. In the UI, you can quickly modify fields, update them, and add new ones. And then finally, GDPR compliance. So the Lytics has a couple different ways to handle this. The first is going to be in the UI, you can delete a profile at any moment, and that delete will include everything. So that's going to be all the raw data we've seen with that profile, every ID, and then any linkages. And then additionally, we have an endpoint if you'd like to use that as well. So we have a couple different features that are going to allow you to manage your profile deletions, and that's also going to be super helpful. And then obviously, how long is a profile relevant, right? So this is not something that we usually get asked in the wild, but something we do like to talk about is anonymous profiles, right? So if anonymous profile only has one anonymous ID and is over 90 days old, right? However long that ID expires, it's no longer going to be updated. And that's across any system, right? That's not a specific to Lytics or CDP, but it's just if that ID is no longer seen in the wild, data will no longer come in for that thing. So you will have profiles in your system that could be over a year old and haven't seen data in a year. So that sort of information, right, is going to be super important for keeping the profiles in the system that you want for activation, and then removing the profiles that aren't going to be helpful. They're going to bloat numbers, that are going to incorrectly skew things. They're going to maybe even drive some behavioral scores, right? So it's important that we remove information from our system that's no longer up to date, no longer valid, and no longer helpful. And that's the process of anonymous calling, is allowing you to do that. And the other piece of that, right, is you can define that however you would like. So in this case, right, if I wanted to say all my profiles who only have one ID and are over a year old need to go, fine. You can also say all of my IDs, if they have these 3 anonymous IDs and this known ID, I want them to go after a certain amount of time. So you have a complete control over what we would consider stale profiles and when they leave the system, which also means that you can have more control over sort of campaign accuracy. So whatever you would consider internally for your rules, we can configure for. And then finally, right, let's talk about the expirable IDs. It's important to understand that expirable IDs can cause a lot of bloat on profiles. And the reason for that is you can have 50,000 of them from a whole bunch of different tools, and they just continue to grow on your profile. But what we don't talk about is after a certain amount of time, they're really not valuable from an ID res perspective, right? Because once again, we don't see those IDs out in the wild after a certain amount of time. They're going to expire, which means no, it's not going to be helpful for stitching information to the profile because you'll never see that ID again, right? But what we would also say is the data associated to those IDs could be really helpful and important. So what Lytics has done is created the ability to sort of compress the profile down and only keep the IDs open that are available and that you can see in the ecosystem, and sort of compress all the other IDs. So the data's still on the profile, it's there, but the traversal that's necessary to retrieve or update or modify the profile stays pretty small. So it's constantly sort of considering the health of the profile over time and its ability to be agile. And that's what we're really focusing on, especially when we know that the more bloated the profile is, the more active they are, most likely in your ecosystem. So it's those highly engaged people that are usually the ones that hit platform limits. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is we want to keep those people healthy forever. We want to make sure that they never grow and hit any sort of limitation issues. And so this allows us to continue to keep the profile up to date, to have the correct information on the profile, but also allow us to control the size and make sure that we're performing efficiently. And so that's going to be sort of the profile expirable. And then we have actual field expirations or constraints. So we can sort of add any sort of level of constraint on the data we want, whether it's account level or field level. What this means is we can say, I only want this field data to stay for 30 days, right? Or I only want the last 30 days of data on this field. I want to keep this many values in this field at any given time. So it gives you a heavy level of control over what sort of information is going to sit on the profile at any given moment. And so that's also going to be super important for understanding or profile efficiency and understanding sort of profile health and the compliancy piece, right? Because we want to make sure we're keeping the important information and it's easily accessible and quickly retrieved for, once again, those real-time use cases. And then finally, because I see we have a lot of questions, this is going to be the summary view of all three: define, construct, maintain. And I'll leave this on the screen. I know it's a lot, but it just gives you an idea of sort of what we're trying to accomplish. And now we can sort of hop into the different questions.
Yeah, so on the question front, I've answered several of them, but I think there's a few topics that come up, or that have come up, that are definitely worth touching on. So one of there are several of the questions were around just the workflow at a high level, from like working deterministic with probabilistic. So I covered sort of the idea of round tripping through BigQuery, doing the work around probabilistic and BigQuery and feeding that back in. But it might be worth just like in a quick 5-minute summary to sort of share what that workflow would theoretically look like in your words.
Sure.
And then I also shared that like it obviously is highly dependent on sort of the specific use case and what data you have access to, what you're trying to achieve. But that one definitely seems like we could probably build some clarity for folks.
Yeah, sure. Yes. So as far as the probabilistic matching piece goes, and how that sort of works with Lytics in our system, and I mentioned Cloud Connect, so I'll sort of walk through what I think a good process flow for that would be, and I consider it too. First is that the entry point for Lytics for all data is on our front door, and then from that we can directly pipe raw events downstream to our Lytics warehouse, right? And from there, you can then do additional layering of ID resolution on there and do those sort of like manual match rates, which is where you can pull it in and you can say, okay, I want to be able to join this person on not just email or not just customer ID or not just profile ID, but address, phone number, first name, last name. And the reason why we say like push it to your warehouse first, do matching there, bring it into Lytics with Cloud Connect, is probabilistically matched data can sometimes skew profile merging incorrectly, which means it tells profiles to merge when they shouldn't necessarily be, which could put incorrect email addresses together, right? And so like for PII sensitive channels like email, you don't want to send the wrong email to somebody. You don't want to have the wrong email in the profile, and you don't want to accidentally send, right, parent email for blah, right? Or household. So it's like, I gave my roommate got an email for me and it was really my stuff, right? Because we share the same machine. So it's, as far as like the workflow goes, that's why we push it into the warehouse. And we say Cloud Connect is a great place to do that, because Cloud Connect allows you to sit on your warehouse and you can pull information from that warehouse and activate and create audiences with it that can be used with other attributes in Lytics. But the way that we store attributes from Cloud Connect is different. So it actually doesn't impact machine learning at all, or data science, which relies on the accuracy of the data on the profile to create the correct predictions. And we want to make sure that whenever you're layering lookalike modeling anywhere across your ecosystem, whenever you're using data science to predict things from your data, you want to make sure that data is as clean as possible and as accurate as possible. But like I mentioned, there's still a lot of value in that reach increase, especially for like ad campaigns where it's not as sensitive. So what we say is go ahead and use that probabilistically matched data, do a little bit more complex matching in your warehouse and bring it in. The second is enrichment. And I'm going to bring up this use case. It's pretty new in that the tech that it's using is pretty new, but I also think it's a great way to bring in sort of that, let's call it probabilistically matched data, is you can use enrichment tools in Analytics Hub Store and BigQuery, which I really like, and allows you to connect to like a new star and bring in that information directly to your warehouse with a connection that's secure through Analytics Hub. And then it allows you to access that data, which is enriched through that source, do that extra merging, bring in that information, allows you to activate directly into Lytics and still, like I said, use it as an audience building block, use it with other features, with other attributes, but that data actually still stays in the warehouse. It doesn't move anything else. It just brings in the necessary attributes on the profile and kicks it out, right, to downstream activation. So you're still getting that reach component and improving on your reach. Analytics can still handle all the IDs coming in from Cloud Connect and merge that information to profiles with Analytics. It can generate new profiles if need be. But what we know about that information is it's coming from Cloud Connect. So we have better control over how it sits and how to use it. And if we do add it to a model, right, we understand that that model might be skewed based off of some match rates. And so that's sort of the workflow would be either to your warehouse or it can come directly into Lytics, but probabilistically match either using a third-party enrichment tool like LiveRamp, like Newstar, like Versium, and then bring that back into Lytics and merge it to the profile, or use a warehouse. If you want to do some of this matching on your own, you have your own algorithms, your own insights. And then, like I said, if you don't want to share that information with Lytics directly on your warehouse, Analytics Hub's also a great way to like push data to a Lytics warehouse that's touching the account, and then all of that data still stays in the original warehouse, and you can revoke access at any time and then easily remove any of that information from Lytics. So it gives you just more flexibility on how that data is handled. And that's my 5-minute.
Awesome. Perfect. I think the other thing that I wanted to bring up is obviously this presentation's fairly in the weeds on the sort of ins and outs of ID res. And I think it's important to call out that like we have all of these technical capabilities. With the launch of Conductor, we've also lowered the barrier to entry to all of these. So we did a webinar a few weeks back around Conductor. For those that aren't aware of what it is, it's our data pipeline management tool. So in that tool specifically, you can actually go through and manage most of the capabilities with Define. So you can identify what are your identifiers, how do those rank against each other, like all of the organization to build up those rules. When you talk about constructing, you can in the UI or in the sort of standard LQL that everybody's used for the past, but you can now in the UI go in and define user fields, update those user fields, and ultimately figure out how that profile is going to be materialized. And then a lot of the tools around maintenance, understanding the health of profiles, where there might be gaps in your strategy, conflicts, all of those kind of things. We're servicing more and more tooling inside of Conductor to help the maintenance piece. So I think the accessibility portion of all of this is also a huge focus. Obviously, we didn't focus too much on the UI today, but for those that are kind of intrigued by a lot of what you've learned here today, definitely worth a look to dig into Conductor, look up the past webinar, reach out to sales reps, technical account managers, whoever it may be, to dig in, because I think Conductor puts a lot of the power of this in your hand and makes it easier to consume. And then
Yes.
with that, the only other question that I think, there's lots of questions that were very interesting. One of them specifically was around duplicate profiles. So it was, how do I, and actually I think we're going to enter a feature request for one of these, is just better accessibility to understand like this group of users have potential conflicts, but maybe just talk a little bit about, how do we handle duplicates? How can you understand duplicate profiles? How can you sort of like help resolve that in the UI at kind of a high level?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. The way that we handle all of our IDs is like there's two different paths, right? There's the single identifier, scalar, non-scalar, which means you can have multiple, right? So we'll cover the case of both. So as soon as you come in with a customer ID, and we say that a customer ID can be seen across these 5 channels, right? Anytime we see that customer ID, it just stitches to the already there ID and that node. So it doesn't try to recreate something. It says, oh, I already see that ID exists. Cool. Here's more data from this channel and I'm putting it here. So now you know that this data is stored with this ID, and that's the single ID, but just know that like you could see that ID in 10 different sources. That's totally fine. It's really just understanding where that data should anchor to. And then once again, how we want to define that data to show up on a profile. Because we can merge 10 different channels to a single field, or we can have, different levels of fields. We can aggregate some, we can put if filters on them so that we can condition what goes into one field versus the other. So there's a ton of flexibility there on storage mechanisms, but just know that there isn't an idea of duplication and that it's a check. Does this thing exist? Yes or no? If it does, then store. When it comes to multiples, right? So cookies is the easiest one because that's the most common, right? Is that a person can have 1 million cookies. The way that works is Lytics stores it into what we call a set. It's a non-scalar array, essentially. And it allows us to store every unique ID in it, but it doesn't add more. So if there are 2 of the same ID, it's only going to have 1 in there, right? And it does that check again. It says, okay, I'm coming in with this anonymous ID. I see it in this set. Great. I'm going to say that this person now has more data on it. So that's there isn't really a concept of duplication, and that mechanic can even exist in how we update and modify and retrieve our profiles. Now, if once again, the question is, I have 2 profiles that are probably the same person, but they're not merging, dub those orphaned profiles, right? There are a couple different ways to resolve that challenge. And it just comes down to sort of one of 2 ways, right? You can use an enrichment tool to see if we can't hit like a store of IDs that they have in their graph they've been building over decades, right? And see if they can't give us some merge directives to unify the profiles. Or, right, you strengthen your first party strategy and get to know your consumers a little bit better. And sometimes these kind of work together, the 2 different strategies, and that we can sort of add more conversion events or make sure that we're actually tracking conversion events. What I found across like 90% of the customers that I've implemented is it's not that the conversion event doesn't exist, it's that we're not tracking it anywhere. And so we're actually missing an opportunity to move a person further down the funnel because we didn't know that conversion event surfaced the information we needed. This is most common in like tracking to websites. When you redirect from like an email to a site, usually in that URL is an embedded ID. And some people don't realize that ID can be used to actually stitch unknown to known across systems quite easily and in an anonymized way. So that's a really strong way immediately to just start to get those conversions happening faster, and then turning that unknown to known into a single profile more often. So I like, depending on what we mean by duplicative, right? It can go either direction, but just know that Lytics handles duplicative data across the board, whether it's raw events that come in that are the same, entire files that are duplicated, profiles that could look the same, IDs. We handle it all the same way, and that we stop it at the front door. We don't allow it to come in. And so we don't have to worry about duplicative information very often in our system.
That's exactly kind of where I was going with the answers, that it, like, you can certainly recognize them inside of Lytics, but if with a proper ID res strategy, you're going to actually prevent the duplicates from happening, which is really where we try to focus. I think that is a fantastic answer. And it also kind of dovetailed into one of the other questions that came up, which was just around why the emphasis on email. And I think my answer there was just that the emphasis on email is purely for demonstration. Obviously, email may or may not be your firm identifier. You spoke to the flexibility of maybe it's a scalar and it's a single value, maybe it's a set. but the point is that our identity resolution at the core is flexible, so that if email isn't an identifier that you want to use at all, you don't have to. It may very well be like the identifier that never changes, and obviously it's going to be kind of brand specific. So
exactly, it's commonality.
Nailed that one also.
It's exactly what it is. And to those of you that are like, email doesn't seem like the best ID, it's not sometimes, right? Because you're right, it does change quite a lot. And then,
well, in many cases, people can have multiple emails, right? Like you spoke.
And who do you reach out to?
A business and a personal, and exactly. So,
and then you need to have a strategy, which a lot of people don't, but you really should have a strategy around which email is king, right? And that's usually channel based. There's usually a channel that's just a little bit more accurate, has a little bit more cleansing on entry. It will give you the email that's probably the better one for communicating anyway. And those are usually the emails that we call activation emails. And this is once again, and this is a great topic I'll just cover really quick, is the idea of ID resolution. In Lytics, all that it really means is that we're able to capture all the right information on a profile at any given moment, right? That's what we're mostly concerned about. That's what ID res drives that value. That is what it's doing. Sometimes what our IDs in other systems don't need to be IDs in Lytics because they don't add any value to that stitching mechanism, right? So we do we do run into that quite a lot too, is helping people understand what IDs they should actually use as IDs in Lytics and what IDs can just be attributes. Because in the end, when it comes to communicating information downstream, they all look the same, right? And sometimes it requires email and a lot of integrations, right? And so if that doesn't exist, the integration won't work. But there's like subscriber key, there's a customer ID, right? In the end, it's a payload. It can be accepted downstream, and then any ID that you need can be passed. So that's also something to sort of remember when we're thinking about ID resolution as a whole, is that it's different for everybody. It's almost different for every tool. And even from a Lytics perspective, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the entire ID resolution strategy across your entire ecosystem to merge every ID. So sometimes that's not even necessary because it just adds unnecessary linking.
Complexity. Yep.
Exactly. It adds complexity where it doesn't need to be. And that to me is sort of like step one is yes, we know you have a lot of IDs. And that's usually where I talk a lot of the enterprise folks who have, massive warehouses with super complex ID resolution to resolve it down. And in the end, right, what we need to know is like one of the 10 IDs. Because to us, it's like, if we can merge on that, that's what we're going to use. And then we'll pass you information that you can continue to use in your warehouse. So yeah, it's all about flexibility here and where you choose to merge in Stitch.
Agreed. Very cool. Well, Kelsey, thank you so much for going through all the details. I know it was kind of a big meaty topic, if you will. Thank you everybody that took the time to join. If there are follow-up questions, please reach out. We'd love to hop on and talk deeply about identity resolution. It is absolutely core to getting value out of your marketing data. It's core to getting value out of Lytics. So certainly interested in any kind of follow-up conversations that you all have. Anything for you to add, Miranda, to take us home?
I just want to add, we also will be emailing out the recording of this tomorrow. So feel free to share it with others. And once again, reach out if you have any questions. But thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Bye.